Hello and welcome to this second part of the ant tutorial where we are going to rig the ant. Let's get started by centering the 3D cursor before we add our rig, because that's going to make everything a lot more simple. So Shift C to center the 3D cursor in the 3D viewport, and we also want to make sure that the rotation and location values for the ant model are at 0. Now let's hit Shift A and add the Armature object, which we can then immediately take into edit mode with Tab. The thicker part of the bone, or the little circle there, is called the root, and then in the thinner part the little circle is called the tip of the bone. Later, when we're animating or posing in the pose mode, the bones will rotate around their root and other bones will connect to the tip of the bone. But now in edit mode we can just rotate with R, and I'm gonna do R90 minus to rotate this bone in the desired orientation, because then we can move this bone here in the front view and place it where the root bone should be. And this bone is just like a handle for easy selection of the whole ant, and we will then extrude other bones from this root bone. Okay, so now when we hit E to extrude, it's really important that we don't extrude diagonally, but we only want to move straight along the x-axis. So we can hit first E to extrude, and then we'll hit X to lock the extrusion to the axis that we want to move on. So I'm gonna tap X to only move in that direction, and I'm gonna move this to where I estimate one joint to be, and I'm also going to move it on the side view, or front view in this case, so that it's following the shape of the ant body in both views. And then it's just some more extrusions along the x-axis, and here I'm preparing to kind of create that connection for the legs, both set of legs, but basically I'm still just working on the spine. We'll do the legs after the spine is done first. So I'll just keep extruding along the x-axis, and also paying attention to the front view here and moving these tips into their correct positions. And finally, let's do the head. And now we have the entire center bone structure ready to go. Maybe it's a good time to save the project. And now I'm gonna make sure that I have my x-axis mirror turned on, because that will save me half of the work when I'm creating my bones. There is one issue first that we need to solve though, and you can see that the mirror axis is at the moment set to Y, so the x-axis mirror won't actually work for our current state of the model. And that's because of the way the reference images were. We modeled it in a certain direction, and now we're gonna just fix that problem by rotating the ant and the bones in object mode 90 degrees. So that we can then soon use the x-axis mirror when we are creating our side bones. We are also going to apply these transforms so that they become permanent, and that we can do by hitting Ctrl A, and we can choose rotation from the apply menu. And now we can use the mirror modifier on the x-axis, and also when we are creating our leg bones we can use the x-axis mirror option successfully. So now I'm going to go ahead and select one tip here, and when you're doing your first mirrored extrusion from one joint pair, you have to use Shift E to extrude to do a mirrored extrusion. So if you just hit E, it won't mirror it even if x-axis mirror is on, but once you hit Shift E like so, then you can get these mirrored bones. And I'm just gonna place them where the legs should start. So that's where I want to place the tips of the bones, roughly like so. And then now when I continue my extrusions from an already mirrored bone set, now I don't need to hit Shift E. Now I can just press E to do regular extrusions, and that should be fine. So I'm just gonna keep extruding these legs until I have them covered. Now we can go ahead and check the hierarchy in our scene outliner here, and we'll see that we have the armature, and then there's the first bone, which is the root bone, and everything is a child of that bone, so we can toggle these children open. And as soon as we get to the leg bones that have been done with the mirror extrusion, you'll notice that they have the _L for left and _R for right next to their names, and that's really important because having the same bone name and then that _L or _R will allow us to do some automatic stuff in the animation stage, like mirroring poses and things like that. So now we can just continue extruding stuff. I'm gonna select this little tip here, and I'm gonna hit E to extrude from there, and actually I'm gonna hit Shift E because now we need to do another mirrored extrusion here. So Shift E for the first set of mirrored bones, and then we can just do the rest with regular E. And we'll move those in place in all directions, and soon we will have this leg ready to go, and then we can move on to the next one here. Shift E for the first one, and then we'll just do the rest with E. Alright, that's pretty much that. There's just one thing, that these bones look a little bit thick at the moment. It's kind of hard to see if they are perfectly inside the mesh because they are so thick. So let's go to the armature settings, and we can go into the viewport display and set them to display as sticks instead. And that way it's easier to evaluate if they are properly inside the mesh in all locations. We can also turn on this in front button here to always see the bones in front of the skin. It used to be called X-ray, but nowadays it's called in front. So that way you can see your bones quite easily. Now let's do the antennas. So I'm gonna do a mirrored extrusion here to where the antennas begin, and then just extrude a couple of times to have some bones also for the antennas in case we want to do some animation with those. And for the jaws, we can perhaps create a couple of joints by copying from the existing bones, just hitting Shift D to make a duplicate, and then we can rotate the duplicates a little bit. So the bones do not necessarily have to be connected via other bones to the bone chain. It depends a little bit if that's needed or not. Basically in this situation for the jaws, there's no need to really have them connected to the rest of the chain via bones in the middle. So I'm just gonna rotate these and place them inside the jaws in case we want to animate the jaws possibly later. Alright, so now that we have our bone structure created, we can select our mesh first, and then we'll shift select the rig in object mode, and then we can create the parent-child relationship. So we are going to parent the mesh to the armature by pressing Ctrl P and choosing Armature Deform with automatic weights. So the weight painting is going to be automatic, and we have X mirror turned on in the make parent settings, so that way we can still keep our mirror modifier intact and move our bones here independently of each other. So that's why it was important to have the _L and _R names in the bones, so things like the X-axis mirror will work properly, and we don't need to apply the mirror modifier even when doing the weight painting. So now we can start rotating these bones in pose mode, and we'll see that the mesh seems to be following the bones quite nicely, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of weird twisting going on, so the automatic weight paint worked quite nicely. So the next step would be to pose the ant a little bit better. So for that we can look at some reference images that we have and see how the legs are posed typically. So we can see, for example, from here that they kind of take this upwards bend first and then they come down. So let's do that for our legs, the first set of legs at the rear end here. And we can turn on the x-axis mirror option from the settings here, so that it's enough to only move one of the bones and both legs will do the same thing. Later, of course, we can do a asymmetrical pose if we want, but now that we're kind of getting started here, it might be helpful to do a symmetrical posing for both sides. So now it's simply rotating these bones the way that we want, so that we are slowly building the pose for our ant here. Alright, let's go to object mode now. We can save our project with a new file name. Now that we have done the posing, maybe we could give this ant a quick material and then we can do a simple animation. Let's start by going to the shading workspace for the shading part, where we are maybe playing with some subsurface scattering. I'm also turning on the rendered viewport shading, and in our principal shader we have those subsurface scattering settings. Let me show you what I mean by subsurface scattering. So if we find one of the reference images where that effect is more pronounced, let me go to the top view of the examples here. So here we can see that subsurface scattering is kind of making the ant almost seem like partially transparent, like the light is going inside of the ant in this kind of interesting way, and we can try to mimic that a little bit by using subsurface scattering in Blender. So let's go to Blender, and then we can go ahead and choose a color for the subsurface. So I'm gonna sample a color from one of the actual images here. So let me just zoom in a little bit, and then I'll sample an area from the picture. Then we can play with the subsurface value here. And we can grab the light and bring it perhaps a bit closer, or maybe even to the other side of the ant, so that we can maybe see how the light is now being absorbed inside the ant a little bit. So there's the effect already kind of visible to us. We can increase the power of the light to see it even better, and then we can play with the subsurface radius settings a bit more. I'm also darkening the world background just a little bit here. We can also try it in cycles, and there the results might be slightly different. So I'm switching to cycles render engine here, and let me also activate my graphics card so it's not so slow. And I'm going to increase the render samples in the viewport a little bit to get better sampling. And it's a little bit noisy, so let's activate denoising here. And now I'll decrease the roughness, and that's going to bring some of that shininess to the ant, and it makes it look a bit better. And then we can kind of see the effect quite nicely, where especially in the thinner parts the light is getting absorbed inside of the mesh. For the eyes we are going to do a different material, so I'm going to select the eye mesh, and then I'll just go ahead and add a second material slot. Let's call this first material ant main, and then we can do a second slot from the plus icon. We can just call that one eyes, and then we can go ahead and make them black perhaps. Hit assign to actually assign that material. We can change the background to an HDR by setting this to an environment texture, and then we can go to a place like HDR Haven, and there we can find some nice suitable background HDR. I'm just gonna go and grab the 8K version of this one, and once that's downloaded, then we can go and import it into Blender as an environment texture. There we go. So now that background is also lighting the scene a little bit, depending on the strength that we can set here. If we set it too high, it's gonna get blown out, so we wanna be moderate. And we can set the film to be transparent, so that while we are getting some lighting and reflections from that HDR, we don't actually need to see it in our render necessarily. Let's go ahead and add a plane in object mode for our ant. And we can move this plane just beneath the feet. And we can see that we still need to tweak the leg positions a little bit more. So I'm gonna go to pose mode, and I want to make sure that there are enough legs on the ground to make it look like the ant can balance in the position that it is in. So that looks a bit more realistic. Maybe we can bend just this leg also, the front leg, down just a little bit. So that's looking a bit better. We can now uncheck X-axis mirror if we want to have some of the joints in a slightly different location, so it's not looking so uniform. So now we don't need the X-axis mirror necessarily while posing. Now I'm gonna go to my add-ons here, and let's search for kit so that we can activate the Blender Kit Asset Library add-on here, which comes with Blender, but you need to enable it, and that's going to be helpful for us because now we can go to the material search and we can search for a nice material for our ground plane. So here we found material and applied it, and now we can play with the various settings of the material, especially the normal map strength. We don't want the normal map to be too strong so that it's distracting, but something like that looks quite good. Let's also turn on depth of field, since in the real life these kind of tiny objects would usually have a quite shallow depth of field, so not much of the scene is going to be in focus when you're photographing really small objects. So that's why I'm also trying to get that kind of blur, narrow depth of field effect going on with this ant render. So I just selected the camera and I'm tweaking the depth of field settings here. And the focus object is the armature, but we can also manually set the distance if the armature focus is not working for us. So I can also tweak the distance setting here until I'm happy with where the focus distance is. Yeah, the units are a bit off at the moment, so I'm gonna change my unit scale a little bit, because it showed the focus distance to be 10 meters, but obviously we are not that far away from the subject, so the scaling was a bit off, so I changed this scene scale because of that. Now let's go to pose mode and do a quick animation example here. So I'm just gonna do something really simple like rotating the head, but then that way you can get an idea of how the animation workflow is done. So you animate in pose mode, and I'm gonna go to material preview, and then I'm just gonna hit I, and that brings up the insert keyframe menu, and I'm choosing rotation because usually, unless you're doing IK, it's the rotation of the bones that matters. And then I'll just move a bit forward in time. Oh, and the eyes are not parented to the mesh at the moment, so let me undo that, and let's fix that real quick. So I want to make sure that the eyes are also following the head mesh, and in order to do that we select the eyes, and then we are going to let me find out the name of the bone that is rotating the head, so that when I tweak the vertex groups here, I can add the eye into the correct vertex group. So bone 006 with full weight, and I hit assign for the eye. And now if I go ahead and rotate my head bone, now the eyes should fully follow it, because they are now assigned to the vertex group with the same name that the bone has. So now that that's fixed, let's go ahead and continue our little animation here. So I'm at frame 25, and then I'll just do RR, double R to do some trackball rotation here, and then I and R. So that way we have now created two keyframes, one for the starting position and one for this second position. We can also animate some other stuff just to bring it make it even more alive. So I'm just adding some rotation keyframes also for that one leg there, and now if we scrub the timeline we can see how the ant has been animated. Let's do a tiny animation also for the antennas here. So I'm gonna select them both and hit R for rotation, and we want to kind of rotate them a little bit when the head is stopping, to have some secondary motion for those. So I'm going to check where the head is stopping, and then we can move the antenna keyframes there with G, and that way there's a little bit of secondary motion for the antennas when the head is moving. I'm going to change this to a dope sheet so that I can better manipulate the keyframes. And if we open the summary here, then we can see all our keyframes that we have at the moment, and it's easier to manipulate them in the dope sheet than the timeline. I can duplicate the starting points here so that the antennas are bouncing back to their original location. And just a couple of more keyframes to kind of wind that animation down, so that it kind of, there's a little bit of bouncing. I'll also do a quick animation for the camera, just a very subtle motion that will always like highlight the 3D-ness of the scene, where we can get a better sense of depth when the camera is moving, even if it's a slight movement. And now we will simply define the frame range that we want to render, and let's set the location of the render. In this situation, actually, maybe we'll do an H.264 video instead of a PNG sequence, just because it's a very short render, so I'm not really worried about it crashing. So now it's just waiting for the animation to finish, and once it's finished, we can play it back. So here's how the finished animation looks like. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Stay tuned for more Blender related tutorials and also other kinds of fast speed tutorials. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.